Just check the recording real quick. Okay. And so we're going to go back a step and look at what is science, what is religion, and unpack that a little bit more. And I'm going to give you some tools today for analyzing these different things and for just analyzing society in general. So there'll be some useful tools for you today that you can use, real simple to remember and real simple to use. It's sort of a way to get the concepts down as to different belief systems. So these are fundamental for our discussion. So remember our communication model that we developed a few days ago was words, terms, and concepts. And that the concept was your private understanding of the terms. That's your subjective interaction with a term like science or religion or anything for that matter. And then the term is in the public domain. So the public says science, and you have a subjective idea what that means. And then you use words to describe what your subjective idea is, and other people use words to describe what their subjective idea of that universal term science means. And so that's where the discussion takes place. That's where the questions come in. And we were talking about those two Columbo questions. What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? Were pretty much the first two questions to try to draw somebody out and see how they're using words to describe their subjective interaction with this universal term. So we're going to do that today with science and religion. We're going to look a little more in depth on those. And so this is from your input 2 weeks ago. For religion, on the board, we wrote down all of these words. We said God, spirit, faith, institutions, church, scripture, theology, and traditions, origins, morality, meaning, and in meaning we mean purpose and destiny, and then prophet. Yeah, someone tripped me up on prophet because I thought they were talking about the money, but they were talking about prophecy. And so I thought that was funny. As I was looking back, I was like, oh yeah, that was my glitch. I heard you correctly, but I didn't know the spelling. So this was our set of words that describe the term religion using our subjective interaction with that universal term. And so let's look at the reading from religion from Adler, that's in Topicon, and let's pull some of these things out. But notice some of these words are based on practice, and some of these words are based on theology or a belief in the supernatural, okay? So like God is going to require a lot of thinking about theology. What do you mean by that word, God? And so understanding or studying what is meant by the word God is theology. This is a study of God. What does God mean? What does that word, that term mean? Also, scripture, is it just writings? Is it just traditional writings handed down from wise persons in the past? Or is it God inspired? Is it revealed truth? So again, there's potentially a spiritual component to that, or there could just be a material component to that. Do you follow me? The material part is the text, right? The words. But is there a spiritual component or not? There could be both, or there could be just the physical. There's at least the physical because we have it in our hands. And I'm not just talking about the Bible. I'm talking about the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, all of these holy writings. Is there a spiritual part to it, or is it just the material part? So you either have the material by itself or the material and the spiritual. You don't have just the spiritual by itself because then you wouldn't have any writings. Follow me? So there's the physical piece and there's the potential of a spiritual piece. Okay. So that sort of prepares us to understand what Adler's saying here. And he says, no division among men or people are as unbridgeable as the chasm between the faithful and those who lack faith. Faith and lack of faith, or the diversity of faith, seem to render certain questions as imponderable as they are weighty. So they're like, what should we do in this situation? It's an ethical dilemma. And persons who approach that with faith and persons that approach that without faith may come to different conclusions, and their discussions are going to be difficult, right? He says imponderable, and yet it's a weighty topic. So that's what he's trying to get to. And here we go. This definition of religion itself is the deepest issue. Some conceive it as having a supernatural foundation in God's revelation and authority, and those who think it's really just natural origin, certain human tendencies, which make it no different than any other field of study. So like religion to some people would just be a set of traditions, set of practices, okay? Not the spiritual component. So there's always the set of practices, what you do, But then is there a spiritual component to that too? And do you believe in that spiritual component or not? That's going to be the thing that really drives people to disagreements. And so this element of culture idea of religion is really a modern study. It's treating this religion as an element of culture, and it's a pretty recent view. But that's where the rub is going to be, and we'll see the whole lecture today. And so to the person of faith, it's going to be much more than just acceptance of a creed, signing on the dotted line. There's going to be a lot more to it, and these are the things that would characterize someone who is a believer in a particular faith tradition. There would be acts of piety. Now, piety, simplest, you've seen people cross themselves. Okay, so that would be an act of piety. They're doing an act that reflects some reverence or some supernatural component to that. Or they're just doing it because they always do it. You don't know. Okay? But that is what we call an act of piety. Acts of worship, the technical definition of worship is just to prostrate yourself, to bow down. Now that can be a physical bowing down, like you see Muslims do when they pray. They go down on the mat and they pray. Or it can just be a bowing down of your checkbook, a sacrifice, of giving money, or your time, marking something in your calendar when you have two conflicts. So again, worship is not just something done on the holy day, whether it's Saturday or Sunday or a specific part of the year, okay? But it's also, again, a bowing down, a changing your priority to the priority of the God that you're worshiping. A recourse to prayer, partaking of sacraments. Sacraments is more of a word that's used in Catholic and Episcopal and Lutheran settings, but it's again, the Episcopal definition is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. So it's an outward sign like a baptism, they have marriage, they have ordination, the Lord's Supper they call it. So there's outward and visible signs, the bread and the wine and the Lord's Supper, but then there's an internal or spiritual component to that. And so that's what they mean by sacraments. There's something that's physical but also has a spiritual component to it as well. Observance of certain rituals, like I just mentioned, maybe the Lord's Supper or certain kinds of things at death, like last rites, a last time of forgiveness before the person passes away, or other kinds of rituals in other faith traditions. Performance of sacrifices and purifications. Now, we might know of sacrifices if you're familiar with the temple period in Judaism, where they sacrificed bulls and goats and so on. So those were animal sacrifices. But again, in more modern day terms, sacrificing time, sacrificing treasure, property, or whatever, giving it to the Lord as part of your sacrifice. That fits into this category. And then essentially all of this wrapped up in rendering to God what the person believes is God's due, and obeying His commandments, beseeching and gaining help from God, and to lead a life worthy of Him. Now, the reason I've highlighted these words, these are most clearly words that are driven by theology. So a different theology will define different practices. Okay? And you have, in some cases, practice and passion, so practice and passionate belief, but in other cases, you just have practice. And so you may have seen or know folks that will just go through the motions. They're doing the practices, but they don't really believe it. Okay? Now, there's no way to know that, but you may suspect that. But others passionately believe it, but do the same practices. So just talking in general terms, okay? But there is this spiritual component that may or may not be there for the person. I guess that's the point, okay? Now, to the person of functional practice, this is what I'm describing. They may do all of these things because these are things you can do. But their belief system, they're really not emphasizing the theology of it. They're really not emphasizing the faith of it. Okay? So even from an outward perspective, you might not have an issue with someone's behavior. It's the belief system that's different. And so it'd be worth exploring. When someone is a faithful believer and you're in conversation with them, ask them questions. Tell me about what you do, and they might describe some of these practices. And then a great question is, what's the spiritual component to that, if any? Or do you just think by doing these things it makes you a good person, a better person? Not a bad answer from a material point of view, right? But yet, it's worth exploring where they are in terms of their religious beliefs. Again, you're trying to find common ground, trying to see where they are and where you are. So when I say functional practice, this would be someone who's going through these practices but doesn't have a strong belief in the spiritual components of those things. It's just a functional practice. Okay. So when this religion is conceived really as nothing more than just a set of practices which someone has adopted, it's restricted just to one part of life. Okay. It may or may not involve action as well as thought. Now, some people may just have these beliefs, but they don't really practice on them. They don't necessarily act on them. Or it may be action and not much thought. But in general, when someone is just a functional practice for them, this religious behavior or activity is not the fabric of their whole life. It's not their worldview. It's not the lens through which they see the world. It's just a piece of their life. Okay. And so this is going to be a place where you're going to have difficulty in conversation. If you're described by one of these and the other person's described by the other list, if you're the strong believer and they're just a functional practicer, you may have some of the same behaviors, but you may have strong differences in the spiritual components to those practices. And so just because you may be sitting next to them, say, in the pew or what have you, it's always worth discovering where you are and if you're on the same page or not. And again, you can do this with these questions without being threatening. So religious people in general have the left side of this list, and some have both. So religious people are going to have those practices that they do, but they may have the practices and the faith that goes along with it. Okay, they have the doing, right? They do the outward signs, but they may also have the being part. The being, when I say ontology, that's the sort of philosophical word for being, meaning the doing, the practices may be prescribed by the sacred texts, but they may be so fuzzy whether it really is God or not, whether it really is a God. Okay, but they have these sacred texts and they're just doing those things that are prescribed by the sacred text. So they have the doing part. But do they really believe that there really is a God, that there really is a spiritual component to it? They may be fuzzy on that. So again, they still would be a religious person. They're practicing a religion, but are they believing those pieces that the religion talks about? And then natural versus supernatural. Again, the physical paper and the words that we have and all of these sacred texts are the natural pieces, but is there a supernatural component to it? Okay, or not? And then human and divine. So they certainly, the people are doing the practices, but is there a divine component to it? Is there anything that transcends those people? So again, you can see how just a practitioner would have all of those things on the left. So it's confusing. When you say the word religion, you get a whole bunch of different kinds of folks. You have folks that are just practicing, and you have folks that are practicing and passionately believing. But they're all religious. So you see, word religious is a bit slippery, isn't it? You've got to explore a little bit more to see. Now, this is the interesting thing. Scientists and governmental systems typically don't fear mere practice because it's just people doing things. Okay. Where it comes into an issue is the supernatural drivers of the practice of religion. So if you have believers who are uncompromising because they believe this is the Word of God and I won't move, and no government can call me off of that, then government has a sovereignty issue with this religion. So it's not just religious people, it's the religious believers, the ones that believe there's a supernatural component that trumps all governments and all systems. Okay. You see where the conflict might lie. And we see that not just in this country, but in China with certain religious groups, and in every country on earth, in Russia with certain religious groups, all through the Middle East. Again, the practices are really no threat. As long as they're not something, it's, child sacrifice or something like that. But we're talking about just your generic religious practices. Those aren't the things that really get people fired up, governments and science and universities and everything in conflict. But it's this spiritual component and the degree of belief that people put into it. Okay? And I'm speaking very sterilely just because it's an academic approach to the topic. Okay. And so how do we have productive discussions about religion? By asking questions, right? So to the extent that the religious hold that their religious practices are prescribed by divine law, which would be above any human law. They're not free in their conscience to entertain contrary beliefs as conceivably true alternatives. Think about that. This isn't a malicious thing of like a child being petulant saying, I'm not going to do what you say because you're not the boss of me, right? Because that bothers everybody. You know, you're trying to tell a kid, come on, we got to go. You're not the boss of me. You know, you're the babysitter or somebody is trying to get this kid in the car and they're not going to have it. Okay, that's not the situation here. Look what it says, that to the degree that they believe that their practices are prescribed by divine law, by this highest authority, they're not even free in their conscience to entertain an alternative view. Think about that. Your conscience is telling you what's right and wrong, and it's going to shut things down that you think are against your conscience. If I were to tell you to do the most evil thing in your conscience, you would shut it down. You could not do it. You might go against conscience, but that's neither safe nor wise. So you've got to really focus on, what is my conscience telling me here? And so again, this is a real issue in the debate or discussion with someone who's really strongly religious, is that they reach a point where they're not even free in their conscience to entertain an alternate view. What's interesting about this is this cuts both ways. Yeah, question?
So like with that, so like since you say they're not free in their conscience, is it because like they believe it can be like a blasphemy kind of thing towards like believing that other things could be true?
Well, it kind of depends on the topic, right? It could be behavior, like this is absolutely wrong to do and I will not do it. Or it could be against their God. This may be blasphemy. I can't go along with that because I don't believe that that's the way the world works. So I can't say that that's true when every bit of me believes it's false. So that might be a situation. So some things, if you're asked to do something that's against conscience, it's wise to not do it and ask for more information. Don't just dig in for digging in's sake, but ask to be convinced, not coerced. Yeah. And then, but the idea that it's not just you're not just being a jerk about it, that you really have a conscience issue. We've really had a long tradition, at least in more free countries, of honoring someone's conscience and not forcing them to go against their conscience. Okay. But what's interesting about this is it does cut both ways. So even a non-religious person will have this kind of feeling. So let's say, because we have this conflict, this perceived conflict between religion and science, I've just replaced 3 words in this. And to the extent that a non-religious person would hold their scientific practices to be prescribed by materialism. And materialism is just that matter is all that exists. There is no supernatural. They are not free in their conscience, it seems, to entertain contrary beliefs and practices as conceivably true alternatives. They may not be being a jerk about it, just like the religious person is not just being a jerk to be a jerk. They may say there is no supernatural, so I don't care how much evidence you point to God's existence, I can't conceivably entertain that idea. Because I hold that there's only matter. And so they can't even conceive that no matter how much evidence a religious person might show for God's existence, their conscience can't even let them go there as conceivably true, as it being conceivably true. And so this seems like an impasse, doesn't it? From someone who really believes in the supernatural and someone who does not believe in the supernatural. And so that's our question. How can we have productive conversations and discussions about religion and science when you have, again, these are broad categories. Some scientists are open to supernatural and some religious people are essentially materialists. But it's those people in each camp, the scientists who are strict materialists and the religious who are true believers in the supernatural, those are the ones that are going to have a really difficult time talking to each other and finding common ground. And so we go back to Peter Boghossian's book, Shift Your Goal from Winning to Understanding. Asking those questions about, I see you're a scientist and so on, asking questions and kind of getting to feel them out in terms of where they stand on their openness to this conflict or not. Do they have conscience issues against anything that can't be explained by science, etc., or the religious person? Do you have any issues of conscience against these other ideas? Could you modify your views? And so I think that's probably one of the most important questions is, if you're talking to somebody, ask them straight up, as we discuss these things, are you open to modifying your views at all? Again, I'm not trying to win you over to anything, but as far as a productive conversation, are you open at least to learning new facts? I am. And so then I think that's a good doorstep for a good conversation. So let's look at a simple tool for understanding different belief systems. We've introduced religion in general, so let's talk about some specific religions, and this is a nice tool for exploring these different belief systems. So we'll get a little bit more interactive now. So this tool is, I call it the ISM tool, and so we'll see what that means. I stands for identity, okay? S stands for security, and M stands for meaning. And so you think about all the isms that you know in religion and other places, and you just take that ism. Whenever you hear an ism, think, okay, where does this person find their identity? Where does this person find their security? Or what threatens this person's security? And then is there meaning that they get from being in this belief system or this group? Okay. So ISM. And so this is just a tool that I've been using for quite a while to analyze the different systems of beliefs that are out there. And now the different religions we're going to study, I have this book here by Fritz Ridenour called So What's the Difference? And it compares 20 different worldviews, faiths, and religions and how they compare to Christianity. So he wanted to do this. This was one of the, I have this from my undergraduate days. So I got to school, I was like, I never have looked at any other religions. Did I just get lucky? Right? And so then I started reading about them, and this was one of the books I picked up. And it's a really great book to summarize the different belief systems. So Fritz Ridenour's book. There's tons of others. Even we have some that faculty here at Sam Houston State have written. Terry Billhartz wrote a book on all the different religions. And so since I was familiar with this book, it was easy for me to find this material. So let's look at Snapshot of Hinduism. See, there's the ISM in Hinduism. So let's look at if we take Hinduism, when we look at the ISM, where does a Hindu find their identity? What are the things that sort of classify or group or construct their identity within Hinduism? Hinduism has a caste system. Some places it's more strongly adhered to than others. Okay, you're going to find variety in all of these topics. But the person in the Hindu is trapped in samsara. So that's this separation from Brahma, the ultimate reality. And so that's what the reincarnation cycle is supposed to do. It's supposed to work you through samsara until you reach Brahma. The security, again, is this path to moksha, or liberation from samsara and reunification with Brahma. And there are three main ways, three paths that you can do. You can adhere to dharma, which is works, good works, as a path to improve yourself life after life after life. The path of knowledge, which is where we see yoga and meditation. And then the path of devotion. The meaning for this person comes through their reincarnation cycle. So this is progressive improvements over millions of rebirths to reach moksha. And then karma, you've heard the word karma. That's kind of found its way into our normal everyday lexicon. When somebody's a jerk, you're like, bad karma, And that fits within this to some degree, because karma means action, and it's that merit-demerit system that is the ethic of the soul. So if they do bad karma all the time, they're getting demerits on their soul. They may actually go farther from Brahma. But they want to work towards that reunification with the ultimate reality, or Brahma. You've heard of yoga and meditation. That fits within, that has roots in this knowledge path in Hinduism. So that's again something that made its way over to the United States from the Eastern religions. And then devotion, this would be worship of one of the 330 million gods. So there's a huge pantheon in Hinduism, although some of the main ones are Shiva and Vishnu. Those are probably the two main gods that are worshipped through devotion. And again, that you're trying to seek assistance from that God in your moksha, your path to reunification with Brahma. Now you can look at this and also be thinking or remembering what we talked about, practices versus beliefs. You could have somebody that's doing these practices and not really strongly believe in the supernatural parts of this, or you could have somebody that's doing the practices and strongly believes in the supernatural parts of this. Let's look at Buddhism using the ism tool. So this is on page 99 of this book. So here we have quite a different set of beliefs. And Buddha was a Hindu and then tried to find a different path. Okay, rather than let's look real quickly. He had problems with the caste system and some of the things in Hinduism, and it was an interesting story that a prophet came by and said that if he ever saw sickness, old age, death, and a monk who had renounced the world, this boy would give up his earthly rule and discover a way of salvation for mankind. So this prophecy, and then so his father hid him in a palace and wouldn't let anybody see him and so on. And then one day he's looking out the window and he sees all four of these things, and he leaves his palace, and he was struck by the joy on the monk's face. And so that was sort of the beginning of his quest for enlightenment. So let's look at some of the things that relate to the ISM in Buddhism. So your identity, you are a consciousness separated from the one consciousness. So in Buddhism, there's really only one thing that exists, and that is God. And you are a consciousness that's separated from that universal one. This is another word for this is monism, oneism. Basically, all is one. That's why if you've heard this joke and didn't get it, maybe now you'll get it. So the fellow goes to the hot dog stand, and he's a Buddhist, right? And he looks at the hot dog and says, "What can I get for you?" And he goes, "Make me one with everything." And that's this. Yeah, exactly. So I know it's just a bellyacre. But the point is, the goal for the Buddhists is to become united with the one consciousness. And the problem that needs to be fixed is that you're a consciousness separated from the one consciousness. Okay. And so then what separates you is ignorance, craving, and suffering. So security, there's some interesting writings in Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path lead to nirvana. Again, this loss of craving and unity with the one. Also a belief that life is Maya, meaning illusion. And so you've heard of this word Maya, I'm sure. It's a popular 3D rendering software, okay, which I think is funny because Maya, illusion, and the software is an illusion. There's three main trunks of the Buddhism religion. That's Theravada Buddhism, which you see the Buddhist monks, Mahayana, and more recently Zen Buddhism, have more theistic language, even though there's really no God figure. Some will say Buddha never claimed to be God, and most of these trunks say that he was not God, but in Mahayana there's more theistic language about Buddha being more holy than others. He stayed to help others when he could have gone to nirvana right away. And then Tantrism, which has more of an animistic feel to it, where animism is where nature, like spirits in the trees, spirits in the water, spirits in the sky, so the nature is animated with spiritual content or beings. So as far as meaning, reincarnation, but this one's interesting. You are in control of your progress on the path, not the gods. So the gods are not necessarily helping you. Maybe that's different in Mahayana, but in typical Buddhism, you are in control of your progress along the path through devotion, meditation, self-denial, mantras, and then the occultic practices would be more with Tantrism. So spells and things like that. The interesting thing about this is a great example of finding wisdom in a bunch of different religions. This is the Four Noble Truths. So here they are. Number 1, suffering is universal. Number 2, the cause of suffering is craving or selfish desire. Okay. 3, the cure for suffering is to overcome ignorance and eliminate craving. And then 4, suppress craving by following the middle way and the Noble Eightfold Path. And then the Noble Eightfold Path consists of 8 ways of right living. 1, right viewpoint. 2, right aspiration. 3, right speech. 4, right behavior. 5, right occupation. 6, right effort. 7, right mindfulness. And 8, right meditation. Those are the eightfold paths of things that you try to get right in your life. So those are the ISM of Buddhism. Like I said, it's a nice little 3-letter tool to kind of understand what the different religions believe. But this could take all day. We have 20 reviews in here, and we're not going to go through all of them with this ISM tool. So let's try to categorize some things. Let's look at just the broad categories of pantheism, polytheism, and monotheism. Okay, so now we're stepping up a level and just grouping the different religious beliefs into those 3 categories. So pantheism, there's really no easy definition and no simple organization because, again, it's by itself not a single religion but a category of religions. But what do pantheism religions believe? God is identical with the cosmos. That is one thing uniform with pantheism, because that's what pan means, sort of everything, all theism. God is identical with the cosmos, which means you are God, but so are all the other things. So you might not be like a piece of God, all is God, but there's some God in you, and a lot of this is self-focused, trying to find the God in you. So you are, the security part, you are elevated somewhat to divine status. You may still have a path to follow to fully realize this with enlightenment and so on, but essentially God is in everything, including you, and you can tap into your Godness by meditation and so on. Again, you can have practices, and you can have practices and beliefs. So it'd be worth exploring if somebody was in a pantheistic religion, how deeply their belief went into the supernatural. And then the meaning, any division of people or the universe or behaviors into good or bad or above or below is illusory as a matter of perspective. Now, this whole matter of perspective, we see this. Even it's not necessarily a religion, but it's very popular. And where have you heard that it's, a matter of perspective in popular movies? Maybe this will help. From my point of view, the Jedi are evil. Okay? And then Obi-Wan responds, only a Sith deals in absolutes. Okay? Which is an absolute? So his head just exploded. Okay, so again, this is sort of a pantheistic system. The force is in everything and permeates everything. It's inside yourself. Focus on your feelings and so on. There's definitely a lot more to be said about pantheism, and here's a good source for you. This Stanford website is a philosophical encyclopedia, and it's a great place to go for more details. Let's look at polytheism. So as far as identity, you are lower than the gods. But it's interesting, the view of the gods too is that they are superhuman in both positive and negative ways. They may be stronger than humans, but they're also more selfish than humans. They're, they have some good traits, some bad traits, but everything's just mega. Security. There's very little security in some of these systems because you are subject to the will and even caught up in the disagreements of the gods. So you're at their whim because you're weaker and smaller, maybe even used by them. But you're secure if your God's on top. And so once again, the worship and sacrificial system in polytheistic religions were to appease your God and make sure you're on good terms with them in case they have a victory, you'll benefit. Okay, so this warring nature between the gods and polytheism. And then the meaning, lessons are learned by knowing about the gods. That's why the epic poems of the Greeks and so on were useful for society, because they would learn lessons by the successes and failures of the gods and the demigods. And we've seen popular books come out, again, that sort of retell these tales, and it's probably a decent idea to look at these books and say, well, that is a pretty good description of the chaotic nature of polytheism, like Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief and those kinds of books by Rick Riordan. I really enjoyed reading those with my kids, and it was interesting to see, again, these conflicts that the gods had between themselves really trickled down into humanity and created a chaotic world. Okay. Now let's look at monotheism. Once again, a good resource is listed there, the Stanford Philosophical Encyclopedia on Monotheism. So identity, God and omnipotent, omniscient, those just mean all powerful, all-knowing goodness that is the creative ground of everything. Now, when I say ground of everything, that means the foundational piece to all matter, but also the foundational piece to all other true things. If there is a morality, then God's a ground for morality. If there is mathematics and logic, then God is the ground of mathematics and logic. Okay. And you, as your identity, you're a creature, not a God. Okay. And again, this is generic to monotheism. So, security, God is sovereign, not you. It's God's world and God's rules. Okay. So there's limits to what you can do, what you can know. Both physics and morality would be under that category of God's world, God's rules. Okay. And then meaning, found in relationship to this sovereign God. So this is where you have the three major monotheistic religions. That meaning is found in some way in connection with the relationship to that God. And we have different systems of practices here in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But if you'll notice about all of those practices, they are, again, in relationship to their God, their belief in God. Their theology drives their practices. And you can have, again, practitioners that just do the motions, and you can have practitioners that do the motions and believe strongly. So let's take a break from all of the philosophy and just look at a simple example, an analogy of monotheism. Okay. Oh, before we do that, there's a ton of other isms. Like I said, this could take all day, but we're not going to do that. Have fun on your own, because not everything's a religion, but it could still be an ism. Capitalism, socialism, communism. Does someone in communism have a different source of identity, security, and meaning than someone in capitalism, or feminism and chauvinism, or fundamentalism, or racism? What is it about a racism that might create a different identity, a different security, and a different meaning for that person? Okay. And it would be worth thinking about, and then in a conversation exploring that to see if your assumptions are right or wrong. But again, keeping it on this level of good questions, you could have a conversation with people on these different topics, and hopefully it would stay positive and stay cordial. So you could ask those questions about identity, security, and meaning. But let's think about now this idea of monotheism and how it may have aided the development of science. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia, this idea of a monotheistic foundation. What does that get you? It gets you this situation of what we call one author and two books. So one author, two books. Again, from the Stanford Philosophical Encyclopedia. What does that mean? Well, if you have a single God, and they've revealed things in Scripture, that's the holy book, right? That's the book of Scripture. But there's also another book that Creator wrote, and that's creation. So nature. Nature is another book, but it's by the same author. So you could see how the scriptural revelation from this one author would be congruent and connected to the natural revelation, the book of nature, by that same author. Like if I write what I believe in two different ways, they're not going to conflict. I could write a book with spiritual truths, and I could write a book with physical truths. Because I'm writing them both and I'm trying to convey truth, they're not going to conflict with each other. And so that's a wonderful foundation for science. Because it's organized, you don't have polytheistic gods at war with each other. You don't have a nebulous sort of God is in everything. And so this is why we saw the birthplace of science really rise up. When I talked about science was best friends forever with religion, this is what I was talking about. So in these monotheistic faiths, whenever society got to the point where people had free time, and they weren't just trying to grow food and eat it, and then grow some more food and eat it, they had storehouses, and society had reached a point where they could do things like science. the monotheistic faith really had a blossoming arrangement with science, and it grew up. It was not called science, it was called natural theology. So let's take an analogy to kind of see how this might have worked. Do you know who Ollie Christensen is? He's the inventor of Lego. So here we have Emmett. Okay. Now if you take Emmett and he wants to know about his creator, he's got a problem, doesn't he? Because he's a little Lego minifigure, and Emmett's a full-blown human engineer, construction worker, okay? And so, if you were to introduce Emmett to Ollie, he would say, Ollie, my Lord and my God, you're my creator. Okay, but let's take this analogy and explode it up. Let's bring Emmett from a little plastic figure up to your capabilities as a human being. But let's also take Ollie all the way up to the same amount. Like his capabilities are now that much higher than humans, and we might see the same kind of thing. We could, Emmett, if he were able to study, he could look at the Lego bricks and say, wow, these all fit together so nicely. And that the holes in the bottom and the little knobs on the top are all the right size to fit in a bunch of different ways. There's different kinds of blocks, and I could fit them together in certain ways and make interesting things. My creator must have had an engineering mind. You see that? He could look at his world, Lego bricks, axles, propellers, bricks, windows, doors, all the special pieces, and he could understand something about his creator. Not everything, but something. There'd be some data points that he would have. That his creator was consistent, his creator was smart, had an engineering mind, built some things that could be put together. The same thing is happening with the natural philosopher or a religious scientist even today. I joke and talk about my chemicals, the atoms being God's Legos. If you look at the Lego store, you'll see, a few million different types of pieces. Maybe not quite a million, but close to 1 million different types of pieces. If you look at the universe, now I think we're up to 118 types of atoms. To build the Lego stuff, we have almost 1 million different types of Legos. But to build the universe, we have 118. And we probably don't even use the last 20 or 30. Okay. So it's pretty amazing. So that's pretty fun to think about. You look at the atoms and so on, I've always called them God's Legos. Okay. So that's, again, an analogy of how someone with a monotheistic view could understand how the book of nature and the book of Scripture might fit together and not be in conflict. So that led to this burst in scientific activity. So when we talk about science, these are your words from a few days ago. Research, experiment, theory, hypothesis, specialization, so like biology, chemistry, mathematics, some would put in science and others would not. Methodical, trial and error, taking observations, empirical results, adapting to the situation, being analytical and curious, and truth-seeking. Now again, some of these are going to be practice-based, and some of these are going to be belief-based. Did you know that we constantly do things that are repeated, but we can't prove that results are repeatable? That's a baseline assumption. That's something that is a philosophical foundation. So you can still have someone, even in science, do the practice of science, and whether they truly believe the philosophical foundations, maybe not. Just like you have someone that might do the practice of religion and may or may not believe the theological foundations for those practices. And so monotheism was a very fertile soil for science. An orderly God gave an orderly universe. And this list is from this book by Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton, The Soul of Science. And it's talking about natural philosophy and the Christian faith. That nature is real and not an illusion. So Maya would sort of shut down science. What I saw today might not be what I see tomorrow. And so if the world is Maya, who says it would be repeatable? Okay. Nature has value and beauty given by God. There's different reasons for that based upon the other book of nature. The other book of Scripture. Humanity is not divine, but has inherent worth. Again, this relationship to the Creator would give in some ways, like in the Christian tradition, that mankind is created in the image of God, and therefore it has inherent worth. But that doesn't mean that humanity is divine. So, this leads us then, since nature is not God, it could be used to benefit humanity because humanity has worth. This also figures into wasteful practices limit nature's benefits to humanity. So care for the environment would also come out of this. So these are some of the things that Piercy and Thaxton put together in their book as a list of things that grew out of monotheism that allowed science to develop. And then I guess the most important one kind of goes back to that Emmett and Ollie thing. Emmett wasn't really created in Ollie's image. So Ollie Christensen made a plastic person, okay? Didn't infuse that person with any ability to think. So the analogy falls down when I say if Emmett could evaluate his world, because he can't. He doesn't have a mind, okay? But in this case, God's rational mind is reflected in humanity's rationality, and that means that nature's understandable. Okay? So if you're an English major and the engineer for this building gave you the blueprints, you wouldn't understand them. But if you're an engineering student and the engineer gave you the blueprints, you would understand them. And so again, this same kind of mental preparation or mental abilities allows the engineering student to understand the engineer's work. And so that's the real crux of the issue that allowed science to bloom, at least in those that strongly believe the religious tenets of their faith. They say God is rational, we're made in God's image, so we ought to be able to understand His blueprints and His work. And that was a real important piece that allowed science to blossom. So this term science has been really tricky to define. It really became common only in the 1800s. It was natural philosophy all up through this, because if you think about it, you had ancient philosophy, Aristotle, Aquinas sort of brought Aristotle up to the modern times, and then as people started looking at nature after Descartes, they started noticing how rational it was, and then they had reasons for believing they could understand it, like we just said. But it wasn't until 1834 that really the term scientist began to be used for natural philosophers. And so the philosophers of science tried to demarcate science from other truth-seeking endeavors. And again, this is from that Stanford Encyclopedia. This is the entry on religion and science. And so they came up with some things like falsifiability, which we'll talk about in a second, to affirm this difference between science and religion. But they disagreed upon how precisely and at what times to make this division. So that's why it's been difficult to sort of define this is what science is. And I would say be cautious when someone says this is what science is, and therefore that group's not scientific, and that group's not scientific, and that group's not scientific. Think about the logical fallacy that might be. I'm not saying it is every time, but what logical fallacy might that be? Here's my definition of science, and you're no scientist. Y'all looked through those last week for your reading exercise. And actually, this was one of the 4 that we covered in class. Yes, Joy?
I may be mixing it up with another one.
Okay.
Ad hominem, where you
It's kind of an ad hominem by saying you're no scientist, right? But I am using a definition. So I'm saying this is the definition of science, and therefore you're no scientist. What's that? I heard somebody. Go ahead.
I'm not sure about maybe it's strong.
Yeah, I think that's susceptible to a straw man. It might be a straw man fallacy for arguing, because what they're doing is they're picking the special definition that gets their point across, when that definition of science is not something that's been able to be tied down. You go to the Stanford, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and you don't see an agreed upon definition of science that everybody throughout all time has said this is science. and we've all agreed on this, therefore I can use it. No, most of the time people are picking a particular thing and saying this is science so that they can make a point that they want to make. And so always ask, how did you come up with that definition of science? And why are you convinced that that's the only thing that it could be? Okay? So that's why this part of the course is fuzzy. What is science? Okay? And it's difficult. Let's look at the ism tool to look at scientism. Because that's a new term. I mean, probably the last 30 or 40 years, maybe 50, you've started to see this rise of what they call neo-Positivism. In that reading that we had on Science and Religion from Adler, it talked about Kant having introduced positivist philosophy. And it kind of self-destructed, and we'll talk about why in a second. But now we have a neo-Positivism come up, and now they just shortened it to scientism. So, identity for someone in this group: as rational beings, humankind is the steward of all and able to improve things through science. Okay? So science is a way to improve humanity and the environment and everything. I'm with you there. That sounds fine. Okay? Security, science, and they define it as things like empirical observation, falsifiability, and repeatability is the only source of truth. Other disciplines are subjective in their value or preference. So like a philosophy or history or someone that's in one of those disciplines, their discipline would not be science if it's not observational, if it doesn't make falsifiable claims, and it's not repeatable. History is not repeatable. George Washington can't be resurrected and studied. You can't do George Washington again and again and again and again like I can do my boiling points in chemistry. Okay? So there has to be another kind of knowledge if history is going to be valuable. But this is saying that science is the only source of truth. So that knocks out history. And then meaning. There is perhaps, and this is, I don't really know in this case, but there's perhaps meaning in relation to one's ability to understand and control and maybe even improve nature. Now I put a question mark by improve because who's to say what's an improvement? Okay. We built a beautiful shopping center and I love the convenience, but was it an improvement? I don't know. We cut down a whole lot of trees to do it. So again, I don't know where the compass points on that. Was that an improvement or not? And then this is characterized as with the radical anti-supernaturalism. So in scientism, there's no supernatural at all. And so that's really the source of the war between religion and science to the modern day. But yet someone in the scientism camp wouldn't have any problem with a religious person who was mere practice, who was just practicing and not believing. That was okay, could be convinced against their conscience because their conscience wasn't driven by a belief in the supernatural. So they really didn't have any conscience issues with some of the things that a scientism person might push. Okay. So this is a nice, at least to define where the battlefront is. And it's really over, is there a supernatural? Because this definition has been tricky, they sort of try to nail it down. And so this is one of the ways to nail it down. You say, well, science can only be experimental. If it's not experimental, it's not science. Okay? What is math then? Some would say math is absolutely not a science because it's not experimental. But yet, almost all of our scientific theories are math heavy. Okay? And some of them are just theories. They really have no way to be tested. Is the multiverse science? That's a mathematical treatment of the beginning of the universe. And good luck telling the physicist who's coming up with the mathematical models for the beginning of the universe that he's not a scientist. Right? So where does math fit into this? It's not a simple question. And then the statement, only scientific truths are true, cannot be true because it's philosophical. This statement is not empirical, it's not falsifiable, it's not repeatable, it's not even theoretical. It's a philosophical statement. And so this is why positivism died, and this is probably going to be why scientism is going to have trouble moving forward, because it makes philosophical claims that are not science. And so if science is the only thing that can be true, then the philosophical assumptions are not true. Okay. And it falls apart. And so that's basically no philosophical statement can be true either. So all of the logical rules too have no grounding if science is the only thing that can be true. So again, a lot rides on this definition of science. So instead of trying to nail it down, let's go the other direction and broaden it. We're going to broaden it too far, and I understand that. But I think that the empirical definition of science is too narrow. So let's broaden it out. I like this from Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. And if you're in the summer, between this year and next, unless you're a senior, but even then, it'd probably be wise to do, get this book. I wish I had gotten this book before my freshman year. Because honestly, all through college, and even PhD, and then a lot of my career, I really didn't know how to read a book. I thought reading a chemistry book was like reading a novel. Start at chapter 1. And some people are smiling. You figured it out. That's not how you read a book, like in your discipline, a science book or math book or something like that, or even a history book. This book will teach you how to skim. This book will teach you how to read for depth. And then this book will teach you how to do research in your discipline. So those are the 3 main skills you learn in this book. It's a big commercial for the book. I don't get anything from it. It's out of, I mean, it's not out of print, but I mean, it's an old book. The latest publishing imprint was 1967. Okay, so it's not like there's royalties to be had. But it's a fantastic resource. So in this, he's got a chapter called Pigeonholing a Book. When you approach a book for the very first time, you've got to figure out what type of book it is. Now, certainly you have, literature, you have novels, fiction, and so on. But he's talking about things that are nonfiction. So we're in the nonfiction category, and you got to figure out quickly what kind of book it is. And so he says in this section, some modern sociological studies merely report the actual behavior of men without judging it. These are neither ethical nor practical books. These are theoretical works of science. And so this was confusing to me, because as I was reading through his book, I'm going as fast as I can through this thing, and all through the book he's talking about, this is a book of science, this is a book of practice, this is a book of science. And he was using science in a broad category, like economics was science and sociology was science. And I had been infused with this idea that science was experimental, that science was empirical. So that was the world I grew up in. And I'm thinking, how is Adler using the word science? And this, I had to find it. I had to go back through the book until I found this paragraph. And he's saying that the theory of the matter, any matter at hand, is science. Science is the theory of something. Notice that's not practice. Practice is how you do something. The theory behind it is the science of that thing. And so this is actually the way we use the word science in academia, although you would probably find very few people that would agree with you on that. If people say science is only empirical, then how do they justify the Department of Political Science? How do they justify the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences? How do they justify the academic fields of social sciences, right? What does that word science mean in the social sciences? The theory of the matter. How do people interact? What drives their behavior? How do people vote? What drives their votes? What drives political systems to do what they do? That's the science of politics, and therefore it's political science. And we're actually using this definition of Mortimer Adler. The theory of the matter is the science of that matter. And this explains one of the most weird statements I ever heard growing up and studying these things, and that was that theology was the queen of the sciences. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever if you're calling science an empirical endeavor. But it actually makes sense if the older definition of science was the theory of the matter. What is the theory of God? What is the theory of the supernatural? That's the science of it. That's theology. And so I like this broader definition of science because it's the one we actually use in our disciplines and in the world around us. And I reject the one that just narrows it down to an empirical science only, or an empirical endeavor, observation and repeatability. Okay. So in the conclusions today, we've looked at many isms, and that religious practitioners differ. They have a depth of belief in the non-physical. Okay. Scientists also differ in their practices and in their acceptance of the reality of abstract propositions. Notice, I didn't really say the supernatural, just abstract propositions like philosophical statements. Would a scientist agree that those could be true or not is a big division. And then a pure positivist mindset is self-contradictory, meaning if it can't be shown empirically, then it can't be true. That statement dies on its own sword. Okay, but a materialist and naturalist mindset may be methodological. So, like when I go into the chemistry lab and I do a reaction, I'm looking for natural causes. I'm looking for temperature effects, pressure effects, and so on. I don't really have a category in my notebook of an angel interfered with my reaction again today. Okay, I'm looking for naturalistic causes. And so those are the only ones I'll propose in practice. But that doesn't mean that I don't believe in anything that's beyond what I could explain. Okay? But as far as naturalism is concerned, when I go into the lab, my methods and my conclusions are based upon things I observe. And those are temperature, pressure, mass, okay, volume. Those are my lab units. Those are natural, measurable things. Okay? But that doesn't make me a positivist or someone who's in scientism. Okay. But then if I believe ontologically a naturalist, that means that only nature exists, only matter exists, then there cannot be any supernatural causes at all, ever. That there would never be an answer that was outside this universe. And so that would be the difference between methodological and ontological naturalism. So those are big words. Methodological, method is in the word. Ontology is the study of being. So think about, does God exist or not? Or does supernatural causes, is there something beyond the material? That would be the ontological naturalist would say no to that. Okay. And so hopefully this has helped you clear things up. So what is our, I guess, for the rest of my portion of this course, our working definition of science? Yeah, the theory of the matter. And again, that fits with our actual practice in the university with departments of political science and social science and family and consumer science and so on. So have a good day.